Apparently we're live.
We are about to go live. Hey folks, how's it going? It's Rob Avis here, and we are live. It's a little bit later than we usually go live, and tonight we're pretty excited to be talking to a mentor of ours. We're launching our rainwater harvesting book after, how many years has it been? How many years did we put into that?
Two.
Oh my gosh, crazy. So anyways, if you're just signing in, I can see there's a bunch of you guys eagerly awaiting the conversation this evening. I would be too. I've been eagerly awaiting it all week because, in fact, Peter, who we're going to be introducing here shortly, and I were just having a conversation before this call, and we've got some juicy topics to talk about tonight. And so if you're just signing in, what I'd love to know is where you're calling in from and what you hope to get from tonight. And tonight you'll notice that I've got a much better looking, two better looking people with me this evening. So one of them's beside me and one of them's calling in all the way from Australia. I don't know if you want to just say a quick hi there, Peter.
Hello. Hi there.
So Peter's been a mentor of ours, and I'm going to give a proper introduction to him here shortly. But tonight we're going to be talking about everything rainwater. And we've got some pretty interesting questions to get into the meat of this topic, but I know that you guys are going to have some specific questions about rainwater as well. And so what we're going to do this evening is we'll do a bit of an intro, and then we're going to ask Peter some really hard questions, because it dovetails really nicely into how the book was written. Peter was actually our technical editor and is the really important contributor to this book, actually. And so we're going to be asking him some questions of our own. But then after we've gotten through our questions, what we thought we would do is we're going to give a book away, which is our book, which is kind of nice. So if you're making comments, we'll be randomly selecting somebody this evening. Good comments might put you a little bit further ahead. I'm not sure, just saying. So lots of comments, lots of good comments. And then
questions.
Yeah. And then what happens after we give the book away, we'll actually open it up to Q&A to everybody out there. And so just before we get started, really appreciate when folks share this link on their social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, whatever social media platforms you guys are on. Helps the channel to track. And yeah, just again, if you're just signing in, let us know where you're calling in from, one thing you hope to get out of tonight's session, and then be starting to think about the questions that you want to ask either Michelle or myself or Peter. And make sure at some point this evening that you check out the show notes below. I know for a fact after we go through this topic, there's going to be a lot of research that you want to follow up on. And we've left a link specifically to Peter's website below, so you can go check his stuff out. He's got a ton of resources there. I was absolutely in heaven when I first found his website. It's really well put together. There's tons of great information on there. So check the show notes, and I'll remind you a couple of times this evening. Before we get started, though, I'd just like to get a sound check. So if somebody out there can just give me a little sound check and let me know if the sound is coming through loud and clear, that would be fantastic. And then once we get that sound check, then we'll get started here. And I'm just going to say hi to a few folks. So hey, Kathy, nice to see you on the live stream. It's been a little while. Hey, Jen, or Northern Bloom, nice to see you as well. New Society Publishers, great to have you guys in the show this evening as well. Dedre Donnelly, I probably pronounced your name incorrectly. I apologize for that. Amanda, nice to see you. I still remember all of our wonderful conversations in the PDC you took a couple of years ago. Dan Roth, nice to see you. Bill Cams, Kathy again. Who else do we have here? Bill Cams and Valley View Farm. Fantastic. Great to have all you guys here. It's so awesome. And it looks like we got our sound check, so we're coming in live and loud and clear. So that's fantastic. So let's get into it. Do you have any announcements you want to make, Michelle?
This is my very first live stream.
You know, we should have got you a glass of wine. I wasn't thinking. Next time, we'll get you a glass of wine. It'd be a little early for glasses of wine where Peter's from, but you know what they say, it's a 5 o'clock somewhere all the time. So yeah. Peter could pretend like he was in our time zone. So anyhow, welcome to tonight's show. We're going to be, if you guys have been following our live stream series, we've been interviewing a whole bunch of New Society publishers. And so for the last 2 years, do you want to tell the story? You want me to tell the story?
Do you?
Okay, all right. I'll keep telling the story because I apparently I have verbal diarrhea. So anyways, for the last 2 years, Michelle and I have been collaborating on this book. We actually got approached by New Society publishers, probably, was it 2 years ago or 3 years ago?
3 years ago.
Yeah, so Rob came over. Rob works at New Society. He came over and he started talking our ear off about potentially writing books for New Society, and Rainwater seemed like an appropriate title for us to take on because we've done quite a few systems up here, and so we took on the project. We thought it was going to be small because they said, oh, 50,000 words, it's not a big deal, and we ended up writing the book twice. And through this process, we got to know New Society publishers who have been an absolute delight to work for. So if you're, or with, I should say, it's been a collaboration. So if you're looking to write a book, you should check them out. And if you're looking to buy books, New Society is a really great publisher. They print on all post-consumer recycled material. They really practice what they preach, and they specialize in niches that are totally aligned with permaculture, ecology, and basically creating the new economy. I'm reading a really great book by Richard Heinberg right now, which is also published by New Society. And they just really practice what they preach. And so they're going to be on the chat this evening. And I know Sarah's behind the chat tag there. And so if you have any questions about New Society or any of their books, make sure you reach out to them and say hi. And I know Sarah will post links to other books that might be appropriate based on what we're talking about this evening. So don't be shy and reach out. So more than a decade ago, I left the oil and gas industry because I was disenchanted with the state of affairs, essentially. I started reading a lot about peak oil. I started reading about water, food security. And essentially, I remember one day getting a video in my inbox from a gentleman in Australia, actually. The email didn't come from a gentleman in Australia. The video was about a gentleman in Australia named Jeff Lawton, who then became an instructor of mine. And after watching that video, 5-minute video, I took out my calculator, being a total nerd, and I calculated that I had about 600,000 hours of life energy on this planet, my whole life, and I'd burned through about a third of them. And I realized that if I was going to continue to work in the oil and gas industry, I was going to be essentially maintaining status quo. I loved my job. It was fast paced. I got paid well. But I remember calling Michelle after watching that video and saying, we're quitting our jobs and we're going to travel the world. And so we went to Denmark. We studied renewable energy, being that we were engineers. We went to Australia and I studied permaculture down there for 6 months. We went to the Middle East, Africa, lots of the United States, lots of Mexico, lots of Canada. And all in all, we probably traveled for 2 to 3 years and spent a whole bunch of the money that we had accumulated in the oil and gas industry and exchanged it for knowledge. And I remember after coming back from Australia, as soon as I got on the ground there and I was on this permaculture farm, I was instantly drinking rainwater. I was pooping into sawdust. And remember thinking it was a little bit of a strange experience because we just a lot of people don't do that up here. But after about 6 months of doing it, it was actually more weird to go home and drink chlorinated water out of a pipe and poop into drinking water. And it was a really hard transition. It was harder to go back to the way I was living versus actually, going into that environment. And so while I was there, I started learning about rainwater and why I wasn't getting sick and how the nutrient cycle works and all these things. And when I came back, we started trying to experiment with some of these things. And we started coming up against a whole bunch of blockades. And some of those blockades are based in myths or false information that we're going to uncover this evening, I believe. And so one of the first things that we ran up into is I actually put in a gray water harvesting system. I wanted to harvest the water coming off of our shower to grow more carrots, basically. And because I talk a lot about the projects that we do, I ended up getting reported to municipal affairs, and we got a cease and desist order to stop our gray water harvesting system. And so I started investigating it and talking to a whole bunch of different regulatory agencies here in Alberta, and started trying to understand why we couldn't do gray water, why rainwater had the stigma associated that it did. And the answers that I got were not great. And so one of those answers was that, and not so much an answer, but I think the people of Canada, people of Alberta, are a little bit complacent about how much water we have up here. It appears that we have enormous amounts of water. Number two, there's water treaties associated with Canada and the United States. And so trying to manage that, I think the regulators are really concerned about potentially not meeting those treaties. And then lastly, there's some issues around our sewage system, which I'm not going to go into this evening. And we can actually have a whole conversation about gray water on another evening. In fact, we're going to be doing that coming up soon when we talk to Gord Baird about composting toilets. So now fast forward 10 years, New Society's come to us and asked us to write a book on rainwater. And it was a really interesting challenge because when we started writing it, the new CSA NSF code, which we'll maybe touch on this evening, maybe not, it depends on how much time we have, was in draft, but it wasn't in final format. And so when we started digging into the research to try and understand why in Australia I wasn't getting sick on rainwater, we stumbled upon Peter Coombes, who we have with us this evening. And so as engineers, we didn't want to write a book to tell people to break the law, because sometimes the best practices are quite a bit different than, and easier to achieve actually, than sometimes the code might discuss. But we wanted to write a book about best practices that could be useful all around the world based on one of the largest rainwater harvesting studies in the world, which is Australia. And we're going to go into that a little bit tonight. And so I contacted Peter, and I was amazed that he wrote me back in minutes, I think. And the more I dug into his website, the more I was just absolutely amazed. And so Peter's a PhD, he's a doctor, has a doctorate in, and I'm going to let him talk about all of the stuff that he's a research and systems scientist. And probably, I might be going out on a, I don't think I'm going out on a limb to say this. I think he's probably the global leader in rainwater and urban water, water cycle understanding. He's an absolutely brilliant guy. We've had so many conversations with him, and that's why we had to have him today on this call. He's written the foreword on our book. And like I said, the link to his website is in the show notes below. And so, the rainwater book that we wrote, along with a lot of Peter's research and some of his other colleagues, aimed to provide some guidance for people that are getting into this, because I feel like rainwater harvesting is going to be a massive industry in North America. And it really tried to suss out the best practices associated with rainwater harvesting from this long-term experience that has come out of Australia and a lot of the research that we're going to talk this evening. So Peter, I wanted to introduce you, but before I bring you in, do you want to talk a little bit about Peter's award?
Yeah, no, I mean, just maybe as we introduce Peter, we want to congratulate you, because just last week you were awarded a very prestigious medal for the best I think it was a best paper in hydrology and water resources. So we want to congratulate you, and just maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
And tell us a little bit about yourself too. Let us know what was your insight that got you into this whole industry and doing all of this research.
Thanks, Michelle and Rob. It's been a pleasure to work with you guys over the last, year or so. Before we talk about me, if we must, I was having I made this decision when Rob first approached me, and then I had a lot of conversations with Michelle after that, is will I watch some rubbish on TV at night, or will I spend 2 evenings a week talking to mainly Michelle and reviewing your book? which turned out to be a lot of fun. There's crap on TV anyway, so we ended up working for about a year of late night conversations, for me at least, or for you guys, and it was a good dialogue because the understanding of water cycle systems when it comes to alternatives like rainwater harvesting is strangely, vastly different all over the world. And what gets me out of bed in the morning is that, well, no, the science is not different. The physics is not different. Gravity still pulls you down to earth and so on. So why are these things so dramatically different? And we've come through a relatively short period of human civilization where we didn't quite understand how things work most of the time. So we'd make approximations, particularly engineers, which is my first profession, which is, I think, the same as Rob and Michelle. And we call it determinism. So we're not quite sure how things work, but we're going to build something to solve the problem that we think it is. Say, we might build a pipe. So we have a whole bunch of lovely relationships that work if you want to work out the diameter of the pipe, but it may not make much sense in the context of the behavior of an entire city. So I work in the behavior of entire cities, entire countries, from the perspective of the smallest elements, which is normally the people and the properties. I got inspired by Donella Meadows, who was the first author in Limits to Growth. And I was lucky enough to meet some people from the Rocky Mountains Institute on the way through who sort of tagged on from Donella and her people after that. And whilst I was doing my PhD, I met Amory Lovins, and I was surrounded by all these systems thinkers. And I particularly liked Donella in her thinking. And I hit on that we do everything from the top down. So we make assumptions in economics and engineering about average people and average houses and average rainfall and average everything, average ecology, average ecosystem. But the reality is none of that's true. It's not true at all. And we've, in the past, when we didn't have good computers or computers at all, really smart people like Donella and Jay Forrester from MIT before her. So there's a chain of knowledge with these systems thinkers, by the way. There's Jay Forrester and then Donella Meadows and then Amy Lovins and co. And they're on a journey. And the thing they discovered is, if we're going to make a difference to the world, it's the little things that are going to make that difference, because they accumulate in systems to change the big problems. We can't solve the big problems with big things, which is quite the opposite that you'll hear anywhere. So getting to the G.N. Alexander Medal, that 20-year crazy journey has been around that thinking. And I was sort of recently, I've had Donella Meadows' last book on my shelf about thinking in systems. And I've read bits of it, as you do as a scientist, and say, oh, I need this, I need this. And I went to my farm and I read the whole book recently, and she said you need bottom-up, self-organizing systems about human and institutional behaviors in your analysis before you can even begin to work out how to minimize human impacts on the ecosystems we live in. And I went, yes, I've been working on that for 20 years. I wish I read the book properly. So that's what I've done. And Engineers Australia, National Committee on Water Engineering, gave myself and my long-suffering younger research colleague, Michael Barry, the G.N. Alexander Medal for that work recently. The particular work was exactly what I've just discovered just discovered over 20 years, overnight success, is that if you're making all these traditional, and we teach it at universities, and I was a university professor, top-down average assumptions, it's impossible to see the value of what happens locally. So you can do all the rainwater harvesting in the world, or all the grey water, or water efficiency, or permaculture gardens. These top-down assumptions in economics and water resources and engineering and in government policy, which is the crazy areas I work in. I've got these 4 disciplines. It's impossible to see the benefit of the small things because of our assumptions. And I, with Michael, have actually proved that. And that's what the award was for, which sort of gets me to rainwater harvesting. The award was unexpected because I wasn't agreeing with the institutions and our water monopolies. I was saying for you guys to do better into the future challenged by climate change and population growth and declining ecologies. Let's face it, they're our challenges. We have to think from the bottom up, from the small to the big. We have to understand our behaviours. And that has been fiercely contested for 20 years. So to sit in a room last Thursday night in Melbourne, which is my original home, I'm in Newcastle now, and to have the award read out was a bit of a shock, but I'll take it. Thanks very much. So I'm a civil engineer to begin, and I apologise for that. Like Rob, I began my career in the oil and gas industry. So in our Simpson Desert and places like that. I won't mention the oil company. They were very good to me at the time. But by gee, we made a mess to the environment. So, and it was commonplace then. We didn't think about it. So years later, you think back and we could do this better. And I then was coaxed out of the senior bureaucracy, so I understand the bureaucracy, to do the best thing in my life by this great professor called Kazira, who was from MIT, but he's now in Newcastle, to do a PhD on systems. And he said it'd be the best time of your life. You won't have any money, but you'll be fine. So I did that. And during that, the PhD was about, if you look from the whole systems perspective, things like water efficiency and rainwater harvesting make a huge difference. And that was in the context of everyone here saying rainwater's dangerous, rainwater makes no difference, saving water makes no difference. We've got this infrastructure, and because we've made our top-down average assumptions about the infrastructure, that's all that can happen. So in my PhD, I found the opposite, and I've been working on it ever since. So I've molecular sciences. I've worked in microbiology, worked on really cool stuff with DNA, which is when you're a systems thinker, small systems, big systems, they're still fascinating. So hence my water quality interests. And later in life, I got law and economics, but I've worked as an economic advisor, science economic advisor to governments for the last 25 years. Normally premiers and prime ministers and ministers wanting a second opinion when they've got the traditional opinion. And then they come to someone like me privately and say, well, does this make sense to you? So that's the space I've worked in. So I've rabbited on a bit, Rob. So if
no worries. No, that's great.
Now maybe I'll jump in then, and because you alluded to it, Peter. And so in your opinion, why is there a debate or such a debate on the safety of rainwater use and collection for home scale particularly? And what's at stake if we get this wrong?
I think that's a fabulous question, Michelle. It gets me back to, sorry, I was on a rantan about stuff. But the thing I wanted to say is I grew up in the outback of Australia. We lived on rainwater. And like most other Australians, it wasn't treated. It was our only source of water. We're an arid country, except for on our coasts. And I was from the outback of South Australia, which is rather dry if you have a look at a map. So the inland in between your ridges is of Canada and North America is quite similar in its aridness. So we only had rainwater and we conserved it and we were doing stuff from the bottom up, if you like. But we had no treatment, no first flush, no end of line, big system, water company type treatment plant processes, which tend to have snuck into rainwater harvesting unwisely sometimes.
And
so,
sorry about that, Peter. There was a feedback there. Keep going.
Yeah, I was hearing myself. That's very scary.
Peter, I just want to jump in and clarify something, because, this was something I had to wrap my head around. When you say treatment and end-of-line treatment, you're referring to chlorination, UV sterilization, or other forms of, metal box, end-of-line, water harvesting, collected, and then right before you use it, some sort of sterilization, correct?
That's correct. This just did not exist in Australia. So everyone outside of our coastal cities, for the most part, we're relying on rainwater harvesting. My own experience and my family's was this water was not treated. Sometimes we pulled dead possums out of the tanks. And my dear old father used to say, well, that's why the water tasted sweet. And he'd take it out and, and away we'd go. We'd keep going. So if you work in medical sciences, you might say we had a well-developed immune system. All of us country folk who grew up on rainwater. If you have young children, you know that your children shouldn't be too clean before 7 because you need to challenge their immune systems so they become healthy adults. So that we live in the too clean environment at this stage. So you guys have got young children. So what I pondered when I went into my research career is, well, everyone around me was harvesting rainwater with no water utility type black box end of line treatment. And years later, when I did a national survey with a whole bunch of colleagues of what was going on all these properties, we discovered what was known as what we call the incidental treatment trade, a natural treatment trade in rainwater harvesting. It's actually the storage in rainwater harvesting, the tank that holds the water, that builds biofilms on the walls and what people call sludge on the bottom, which is also a biofilm. And these things are actually quite the opposite to the literature in the water industry, mains water industry, with biofilms in pipes. They think are bad because they diminish the effect of chlorine. In a rainwater harvesting type natural environment, those biofilms are very powerful of pulling out all sorts of contaminants, metals, bacteria, because rainwater harvesting is a low nutrient environment, right? So biofilms need to live on eating whatever passes them by. And that's why if you ever worked in the wastewater industry, you'd see the old-fashioned trickling filters. So the trickling filters have a biofilm or sludge or slime, as you call it, on them, and it's very hungry. So it grabs nutrients and everything and other bacteria and metals on the way past. Because rainwater is a very low nutrient environment, extremely low, and the rainwater ecosystem, compared to some other things around, has a lot of bacteria in it, mostly harmless. What these biofilms do is they eat the other bacteria. They strip out the nutrients and the other materials from the water environment, the water column, if you're a scientist, because they're hungry. They need to survive. So we found that was a process. And there's a natural process of settlement going on in the tanks. And at the very top layer of the water is what's known as the water surface microlayer, where a lot of harmful stuff just stays there. And if you don't touch that and you harvest your water from below that, you're fine. So Australians don't take the water from the very top layer or anywhere near it. So what we discovered is it was assumed based on water utility type thinking that people weren't treating their rainwater and they weren't managing it. What I discovered was people were actually, they had a more natural organic system, a treatment trade, which we've called it, of processes in how their rainwater harvesting systems work. And that's probably why, for the majority of cases, more often than mains water, as our epidemiological studies have found, Australians were not sick from rainwater. So it was an accidental discovery.
Amazing. Peter, one thing that I want to just bring to light for folks is probably one of the things that we have to be most grateful for is that Australia did develop with rainwater, that you guys are so water poor, and that you were forced to figure these systems out. I mean, it's very difficult, I think, or it should be very difficult for a regulator to turn a blind eye to the fact that, and I could be wrong with my numbers here, but I think, is it 6 million people in Australia are using rainwater on a daily basis, and 3 million of them without end-of-life treatment? Am I getting that right, or am I misquoting that?
So Rob,
thank you.
So Rob, your numbers are right. It's about 3 million people every day drink the rainwater, mostly without the enormous amount of treatment, end-of-line treatment that people tend to talk about with rainwater harvesting. And we'll get to that. About 6 million people throughout Australia use rainwater for some use. It's the third, and you won't see this in the mainstream literature, but we're publishing our own literature on this at this stage. It's the third most important source of water in Australia after surface water and groundwater. Then it's rainwater. You see a lot of mainstream literature on desalination from Australia, but that's a long way after rainwater as a source of water.
And it must be because the rain it falls differently in Australia, right? I mean, it must be safe because somehow the rain is different than it is in North America, right?
No, not at all. And I, in my work with your Canadian government, your national government, and in my work in Texas, I found that once I left the city, lots of folk were using rainwater harvesting anyway. And because of the quite negative perceptions about it, which is your parallel with us, people were just not saying a lot about it. They were just using it because they needed to. In Australia, you'll have regulators in cities, because cities have government water monopolies, would actually say, oh, rainwater is really dangerous, you can't use it. But as soon as you step out of the city limits and you can't get a water supply from your government water monopoly, they'll say rainwater's okay, we don't want to talk about it. So there's some, sorry, I work in this policy regulatory space, there's some real inconsistencies. Having said that, which is what is so great about your book, you've still got to recognize how the processes work, the natural treatment train. It's not going to work by magic, you have to help it. And you do actually have to add to that where needed to make sure you've got a safe system.
Right.
What in this Australian example about what goes wrong if you don't have that system is not too much. Every now and again someone gets sick, and with not as much as you'd expect, but you probably don't want, the one in a million person to get sick or whatever it is. So you actually want to have a design that is fit for purpose, which is what your book is about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was doing the research and writing the book really opened my eyes to, wrapping my head around this safety issue. Because if you start, where I started with a lot of the North American codes and standards, and even the legal environment, where here it actually is currently illegal to harvest rainwater in Alberta. And there's places where you can drink out of a dugout, but you're not allowed to harvest or utilize rainwater. And if you are, you probably have to chlorinate it or sterilize it in some way, shape, or form. So that was, and just even wrapping my head around what the rules were, and then stumbling across your research, Peter, that really talked about this idea of like a natural treatment train and using good design and sensible maintenance, and how good design and sensible maintenance could ultimately really assure quality drinking water for people. So with that, let's summarize maybe what some of those good design and sensible maintenance practices are for this treatment train, this natural treatment train.
And totally agree, Michelle. And I had a young man called Anthony Spinks did his PhD with me on that after I thought this was what was going on from the national surveys, and Anthony actually proved that to be the case. So the challenge is to understand what's going on wherever you are in your house, you know, in my county or whatever you guys call it. I don't know what a dugout is, by the way, guys. So
No, it's basically a pond. You guys call it a dam. So
no way. That's far more dangerous than
It's
rainwater.
a puddle. You're allowed to drink out of a puddle.
And get this, Peter.
Yeah.
So I get calls all the time from farmers that are drinking out of their ponds, but they're basically just holes in the ground. And guess where they place all their ponds? They place them at the bottom of the watershed so that they fill. and the Alberta government has a whole PDF on how to drink that water. And it's just unbelievable that we're allowed to do that, but we can't drink the water that falls on a properly designed. Well, that's changed now. The codes have changed.
Changing.
But
And,
prior to this, that was the kind of the status quo here in our province.
So, you know, we wrote a paper on this very early because we had these sorts of bizarre, illogical statements in policy here in Australia. And young Anthony worked with, I shouldn't say young, he's probably 40 now, so worked with me on this, and so did others. And that very proposition was raised on the dams and grey water were actually safer than the rainwater from your roof. Unfortunately, our national health guidelines said, well, you know, if you're harvesting rainwater from your roof, all of the primary vectors for illness don't exist on that roof unless you're a cow. You got to get a cow up there or a human to defecate on your roof. You know, the primary reservoirs for the serious illnesses are not there. You know, cryptosporidium comes from humans and cows, right? You had the big Milwaukee outbreak, which was world famous in the US, that came from crypto from cows, you know, pooping in the catchment that ended up in the groundwater and made a whole bunch of people sick, 500,000 people or something. If cows and humans and higher order mammals are not defecating on your roof, there is a lot of risk that's not there anyway. So that one part about understanding a treatment trade is, which you guys have got in your book, which is great, is doing a logic tree about, well, where's the risk going to come from? And what is really good in our national health standards from a chap named David Cunliffe, who's chaired this for years around rainwater, is that, well, if higher order mammals aren't directly impacting with your catchment surface, those illnesses aren't going to be there. And lower order mammals like possums, or your equivalent to possums, are the squirrel, aren't they? So
yeah, or the raccoon. They call them, what do they call them in Ontario? Trash pandas.
They're genetically, their genetic relationship to what's going on in them with the potential to make humans ill are quite a lot different to what we read in the literature. But to take people through that would probably make people's eyes glaze over. You know, you can become, a pathogen must be genetically disposed to actually making you sick. There are some pathogens in animals that actually can't make humans sick.
Right.
Even though there's a lot of rhetoric about it. They just can't. It's genetically impossible. But there are others that can. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So starting with the minimizing vectors and, you know, right?
Yeah, protect the roof. I think, and just for folks that haven't heard of Anthony Spinks, I mean, Peter just brought him up, but we'll make sure we put a link to his, which is linked on Peter's website as well, but I'll find it for you and put it up there. That thesis completely blew my mind. I just want to touch on a couple of highlights that I came across that are coming to my mind. And again, Peter, you can correct my numbers if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm in the right order of magnitude. I believe that the biofilms, when you guys tested the metals, again, kind of talking about this treatment train and the importance of storage, which, by the way, the other interesting thing that was in that report was talking about how the Romans observed water quality improvements through storage, but they couldn't explain why. And I think Spinks's report really shed some light on this. And so the biofilms were accumulating metals, as you said earlier. And I believe that, was it lead, Peter, that had a 300,000 time concentration relative to the center water column of that tank? Am I quoting that number correctly?
Greater than 300,000. Yes, it's really big numbers. So that's evidence of what I'm talking about before. The biofilms just strip these things out of the water column because they're hungry. So it's an amazing result. So you keep going. So
yeah, I mean, basically the concentration of the biofilms, the UV treatment that actually occurs on the roof, if light's hitting the roof, the exposure of the gutters, so making sure that the gutters are properly drained and that they're getting sunshine as well if possible. You know, those are a few of the things that I'd not directly thought about, and but just really the stuff that kind of stood out was how the sludge layer and the biofilms are really acting not just as entities that were just kind of hanging out and enjoying the ride. They were actually producing an ecological service. And so if the treatment train was properly designed, we could actually ensure that we weren't getting in their way, so to speak, and ensuring that they could fulfill their function. And now that we know that they're there, we can actually make smart decisions about how to protect them. Because I remember reading in some of the research that they still function, but there was sometimes a detrimental effect to the addition of chlorinated mains water. And of course, it would have a detrimental effect to living things because chlorine is designed to kill, basically.
So, thanks for raising that. During my PhD, because there was a health department in my steering committee, we ended up, because they insisted on it, chlorinating a couple of the rainwater tanks at Fig Tree Place. And what actually happened after that, which I know now why, is we actually made the rainwater quality for a year after far worse relative to the tanks we didn't chlorinate. And we now know, we knew quite a few years ago, because adding chlorine to that environment kills the good things in the ecosystem that are helping you. But if we could step back a little further on that, Rob, everything in the ecosystem does something important.
Right.
It's a really primary issue, and you guys have got a permaculture background, and that should be, so that's, bread and butter for anyone working in that sort of area. But the other thing we found is it's probably not a great idea to be throwing chlorine into your home water supply system, because chlorine is actually a deadly chemical, deadly to humans as well. And people actually forget that. And I think sometimes it gets lost in the regulatory discussion. Oh, the water mightn't be safe. We don't know that it mightn't be safe, but we think it mightn't be safe. We're risk averse. Just throw some chlorine in. The thing that you're throwing into the water is orders of magnitude more dangerous than what might be in the water. And some might be offended with that comment, but you need to be very careful. If you mix chlorine with organic materials, you can actually create carcinogenic compounds as well, which is the major challenge of the big water supply systems around the world. If you've got to be careful of use of unnatural chemical additives in the environment. So, for example, chlorine and a range of other chemicals. So
this. Oh, sorry, Peter.
Sorry, don't put chlorine in your rainwater tank. Sorry, keep going.
No, I was going to say Nassim Taleb calls this, and I think it's other people call it as well, but iatrogenics. So it's the attempt to do good, but you end up doing harm. And I think I've thought a lot about chlorine, and it's really a matter of managing. People or regulators that use it or industries that use it are managing short-term risk at the expense of long-term risk. And it's so great to have such a large case study to show this. And I mean, even to the point where we actually removed the water that we do get, where I can't drink chlorinated water. And I think it was in the Spinks report too. It was not I don't think it was a key area of study, but I remember reading something somewhere about a slight statistic. It was statistically important enough to mention that even children that were drinking rainwater that had, chlorinated water had a slightly higher incidence of sickness, I believe. And that really stuck out for me because when I left the permaculture farms that I was drinking rainwater at and went back to Sydney to pick Michelle up, she came to visit me. I remember feeling sick. The first time I felt sick in Australia was when I switched off of rainwater back onto mains water, which was a really interesting experience for me.
So that's, there's a phenomenon known as traveler's diarrhea, and it's just all about the different qualities of water rather than whether or not water's harmful for you. And Jane Hayworth, who wrote that study, she did it twice because they didn't believe it the first time about children were better off on rainwater than they were on mains water, and the second study found they were no worse off. So she had two goes at it and similar result. What she also spoke about, which is well known if you read more deeply in the health literature, is changing your water source can give you the trots, as we say over here, but it doesn't mean you're sick. It's just your stomach is getting used to a different type of water. It's probably changing your diet as well. If you start eating a completely different type of food, your stomach will act up a bit for a while, and that's natural. So they're the things to consider.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the reasons that in medieval Europe, they just told people to drink beer, right?
Yeah.
It was all sterilized.
I want to get back to the treatment train and this idea of a well-designed rainwater harvesting system acting as a treatment train and actually having multiple barriers. And we started with talking about the roof a little bit. We didn't get to talk about roof materials, and I've seen a few comments in the chat feed about that. So one thing that I learned is, yes, the materials are important, but the epiphany I had in doing the research and writing the book is that the materials were actually less important than I originally thought. Like, I feel that a lot of the, before stumbling into Peter's research and the I had thought that really it was the materials that were most important. And after reading, I realized processes that was going to have a bigger impact on your end use water quality. So just speak to that a little bit, Peter, and let me know if you agree or disagree.
I think the Atlantic cable let me down a little bit there. I only heard half of what you're talking about. However, I'm on the wavelength. So Michelle, there's another lady called Abigail Morrow who did a PhD with me a bit later, and the steering committee around me were adamant that the materials in the tank and the materials in the roof would dominate rainwater quality. The chap who did a PhD with me before that continued on with my work. His name was Craig Evans. He worked on ecosystems, but we'll get to that. And we found them our primary position was, gee, the materials, what the tank's made out of, what the roof's made out of, in the context of a properly operating treatment train, don't mean much, with some notable exceptions, like lead flashing. So
lead flashing is no, yeah.
So, but that work with Abigail revealed some other stuff that were unmentionable in the water industry that, well, the rainwater wasn't really so much of a problem. The roof materials, with some exceptions, were not so much of a problem. Depending on the end use of the rainwater, you know, what you're going to use the rainwater for, and depending on whether or not you had the right type of design and treatment train in place. So the passage of water from your roof to your roof gutter, you know, down your downpipe, maybe through a leaf diverter, maybe through first flush, though I'm not a huge fan of first flush devices. I think they're overemphasized in their ability. If you make them too big, they're working against you. Through the storage processes in the rainwater tank that are really powerful, harvesting the water from the right place in your rainwater tank, so you let the biofilms work properly for you, nowhere near the top, by the way, but not on the bottom either, and then through a pump or a process. And then when you got into the house, it depends on what you're using the water for. If you're passing through a domestic hot water system service, for example, in Spinks's work and my original work, we actually found that the temperatures you're required to have your hot water system on in a normal house were actually stripped out most of the harmful or all of the harmful bacteria that might be in rainwater. But coming back to the effective roof materials, lead flashing is an issue. We need to be careful about that if you're drinking or using the water for cooking. Otherwise, it's not a huge issue, but I just think, generally speaking, we should get rid of lead flashing from roofs, but that's just my personal view. There are far better materials.
And, you know, it kind of comes back to that, just a permaculture principle of feedback. And sometimes we put these toxic materials, you know, say on our roof because the water is draining to the storm sewer. And it's like, well, that's okay. It's just draining to the storm sewer. And then the second you encourage someone to maybe redirect that downpipe into their own garden, they're really concerned about the roof material. And it's really interesting. It's interesting how habits or feedback affects habits. And suddenly we care a lot more about what's in that water. And maybe it actually shouldn't make that big of a difference, whether or not it's going into the storm sewer, or whether or not it's going just into your garden. But what was really interesting was what the tank and how the tank, a properly designed and maintained tank, could do in terms of improving the water quality, even if you didn't use the ideal roof materials.
That is absolutely true, provided you didn't keep sticking chlorine in it. So
yeah, well, and I actually read several documents on maintenance practices for rainwater systems that were recommending annually you drain and desludge and basically chlorine clean your tank every year that you do that. And that's out there. That kind of information is out there. So in complete contradiction to your research and some of the research of your grad students.
And I think I've sort of alluded to this in the foreword to your book. There's two main schools of thought in the industry, one from the product suppliers and one from the centralized water supply. So if you're draining your tank every year, you need to buy a tank vacuum and all sorts of other products that you could use. But if you assumed you had to use that stuff all the time, you would be buying all these products to do this stuff. So that sort of advice we've actually found would perpetually make your rainwater worse. So you would only clean out your tank if there was something wrong with it.
Right.
And there are easy ways to do this. You'll see all those standards written saying, oh, treat and collect water and subject it to all sorts of tests. Our experience in Australia, which is in our conservative national health guidelines, is doing a lot of chemical and microbiology tests of home scale rainwater harvesting systems is close to useless.
Right. Yeah.
The good old fashioned approaches that I discovered in the field. Is the water clear? Does it smell? Are some of the best ways to make sure your system's operating properly?
Right.
Obviously, if the water's not clear coming out of your tap and it's starting to smell, you've got a lot of debris in your tank and it's decomposing. You get the rotten egg smell from that process, for example. So there's really common sense maintenance processes that aren't that onerous. The problem with, say, taking a lot of E. coli samples from rainwater harvesting, we discovered there's more than 30 environmental species of E. coli. Nothing to do with poo. They're natural in the environment. So if you want a very risk-averse, safety-first system for, say, a water supply system supplying 1 million people, you need to be very, very careful, don't you? You have to be very risk-averse. And your enclosed pipes and water treatment systems and so on, if you found some E. coli in there, you'd be a bit worried because you could make 1 million people sick. But the tests aren't that great because your E. coli picks up all this natural environmental bacteria that's harmless to us. E. coli is not harmful to humans except for a couple of mutant strains of E. coli, like 0157 is rather dangerous, but that comes from cattle again and humans. So we actually use environmental indicators to indicate that there actually might be some fecal contamination of our mains water systems. So a lot of the tests that are used actually use a collection of environmental bacteria to indicate there might be E. coli in there, and that's an indication that there might be fecal material in the water. And that's really great, and it served us well in a big centralized system where lots of people are connected. The risks are very high, and the consequences of getting it wrong are high as well. The home scale system and the big system seems to be remote, semi-remote from the environment. Your home scale system is actually an ecosystem, working with your home, working with nature, working with an ecosystem source of water, rainwater. So you need to be careful to make sure that your measurements are not of an ecosystem that are harmless to you, creating outcomes that you shouldn't be doing. So I hope that makes sense. So
yeah, that makes total sense. I'm just gonna say that what I'll do, it's gonna be hard to get through everything I'd love to get through in this talk, but in the book there's a table 8.1, and it summarizes all the good design and sensible maintenance practices. And I just want you to see that it's pretty simple. There's just a one pager, and I will put a PDF of this one page in the Essential Rainwater Harvesting Toolkit. So if you go to essentialrwh.com, you can sign up for the free toolkit, and you can download this one page that really summarizes what we're calling good design and sensible maintenance that ultimately help support those inherent treatment train processes and deliver quality water in your rainwater harvesting system. So I'll put that in there because I have a feeling we're going to have a hard time getting to all of these little points. And I think that's kind of the easy stuff, to be honest. There's some great questions here that I received before the show started, because our book is a little bit unconventional in North America in that, we don't talk a lot about that end of line treatment, UV sterilization and chlorination as a way to guarantee certain water quality. We talk about this idea of good design and sensible maintenance based on this body of research. I did get some emails and we've received some concern and some feedback from industry professionals and other rainwater harvesting practitioners about, here are my concerns and my questions with your approach. And so I'm going to use this opportunity to bring a few of these up.
And before you do, so we'll go through a few of these, then we're going to do our book draw. And so we're giving a book away tonight for free. That one, of course. And then we'll open it up to Q&A for the audience, because I've seen a lot of questions coming in. And I'm really excited to actually have an ongoing conversation with Peter. I mean, he's got so much experience, and I know rainwater, like I said, it's becoming a big thing in North America. We've got a lot of droughts. We've got a lot of water issues, which is a bit ironic because mostly it's just a maladapted approach to how we utilize water in North America, but that's another conversation. So if you're finding this interesting, hit the subscribe button, and we will be having more conversations on rainwater in general, and I will be bringing Peter back onto the show in the future to help disseminate some of this knowledge for folks, so that as we move into the 21st century and we start to adopt systems that we should have adopted a long time ago, that the right information is available at the right time, so that we can make this transition effectively, and not avoid the mistakes that we could very easily make if we're not making decisions based in science. And we're lucky to have such an incredible body of science to draw from. So let's talk about a few of these questions, then we'll do the book draw. And there's also a discount in there.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Do you want to mention that
at
quickly?
the end?
Okay.
Or after, during the book draw. For everybody who doesn't get the book.
Yeah, so we're not going to tell you, so that it's a bit of a cliffhanger and you stay right till the end. So just stay tuned. It'll be worth it.
Okay, Peter. So one email I got was someone was concerned about Legionnaires, and particularly the risk of Legionnaires in irrigation systems, in systems without any kind of end of line box treatment. Your thoughts?
Thank you for that question. It's a pet issue of mine, and with Anthony, we did a lot of research in Legionnaires. So firstly, Legionella species, which is a whole range of bacterial species around Legionella, not all of them harmful, are ubiquitous in all water, including the mains water that comes out of your tap from your water authority. But completely harmless unless you heat it up to blood temperature, say in a cooling tower, for long enough for it to become viable and start reproducing in a hurry. And then that cooling tower or similar thing would have to develop mists, and you would have to breathe in sufficient amount of the aerosol Legionella from this warm to hot water system that's activated the Legionella to make you sick. So you ingest it into your lungs, and very small doses of it can make you ill if you're immunosuppressed. So you're unwell or an old person and so on. However, I've just finished a big study for our hospitals in Victoria, sorting this out for them. However, there are other assumptions about Legionella are just not right. If you don't activate it using, a cooling tower or a warm water system, you're not actually generating dangerous aerosols. So when I first saw that question around irrigation systems, I thought, are we in Barbados? So you've got very hot water that you're irrigating with. And people are right to be concerned about Legionella in hospitals using warm water systems, which is I've just finished working on for our government, because they don't want to scold old people. They're warming. They have their hot water systems set at about 42 degrees to 45 degrees centigrade, which is perfect for Legionella. That's when it's viable, around that temperature. So mist created in that environment can potentially make old people sick, and the majority of our outbreaks around the world are around hospital warm water systems, and around cooling towers that do similar things at similar degrees, temperatures on high-rise buildings and so on. Around irrigation systems, the risk is remote to non-existent. I was really surprised to see that. But I've worked in government policy all my life, but what tends to happen, the regulatory process, people think, oh, this is a risk in a hospital, therefore it must be a risk everywhere else. And if people can die from Legionella, it becomes this assumed risk transfers to many other areas. Then we've got an irrigation standard in Australia, which our very conservative National Health Council has written. It doesn't see it as a primary risk at all. If you are concerned for some way about it, irrigate at night. So
Right. Yeah.
when people are not there, which is our primary advice. And in fact, David Cunliffe, who is the chair of that guideline in Australia as well, I asked him about this when I was doing my review here for our government. I had to hold the phone out a bit. He said, I don't know why people are putting UV treatment on all these irrigation systems, because the risk is minuscule, provided, you know, they're designed properly and so on.
Right.
But if you're really risk averse and worried about it, all you do is irrigate at nighttime or when people are not there. And Legionella is very prone. It doesn't like changes in temperature. It doesn't like UV. So if it was magically there and magically viable in the water, say on your sporting oval, it just doesn't stay there. So it just it dies off. So they've got some really conservative rules about irrigate at night if you're really worried about it. But they're not talking about Legionnaires disease. They're talking about irrigating with wastewater and other things in these national guidelines we've got. And don't let anyone on the sporting oval for, say, 2 to 3 hours. So, you know, there probably needs to be some deeper thinking and more common sense about Legionnaires disease and different water systems.
What about maybe on a similar vein of thought is biofilm accumulation in irrigation lines? Another another potential issue that's been brought up to me in a reason to do end of line treatment, like sterilization of some sort.
If you've got a roof harvested rainwater system, because it's low nutrient anyway, and your biofilm process is going to be in your rainwater storage, and then it's passing through a pump, because pumps actually eliminate bacteria as well, because bacteria doesn't like pressure. The opportunity for biofilms in your downstream lines on that type of rainwater harvest system is actually quite small. But let's examine the perception in the water supply industry that has hundreds and hundreds, thousands of kilometres of pipes. They're really worried about biofilms building up in their pipes because it deactivates chlorine. That's their primary concern about it. Right. So the logic from different industries seems to get transferred in this space to other industries like rainwater harvesting and irrigation.
Right.
Not correctly. It's an incorrect transfer of logic. So the biofilm in the irrigation system would be a pain in the butt if it was, say, from stormwater, because a roof harvester system, the biofilm is going to be a low probability, and it's not going to create any harm anyway, because you're not trying to buffer a chlorine residual, are you? So in your say your irrigation system, so you had another source of water, what's its real problem in irrigation? It's if there's a biofilm, because you've got a high nutrient water source, so it won't be rainwater, they're going to eventually break off and clog up the nozzles in your irrigation system, say if you're using a dripper system. And they're eventually going to be a problem in any sort of spray system you're using, because they'll interfere with the engineering mechanisms in your system. But other than that, there is no harm.
It's not a health issue. Yeah.
Not a health issue.
Yeah.
Just assumed to be one.
Yeah. Another one that I've seen is concern around coastal areas potentially with high, avian or bird fecal loads on the roof. And we've talked about this. I thought, and we had a really fascinating discussion about how, high nitrogen load like that interestingly enough, the best way to likely deal with a high nitrogen load would be with the inherent treatment train, the biological treatment train in the tank, versus trying to deal with that using some sort of end of line sterilization or chlorination. Do you want to maybe add something or anything to that?
You're reminding me of a 2-hour fascinating conversation you and I had, Michelle. So I'll summarize that because I know Rob's got all this other stuff, and so have you. You want to get to so. In a roof harvested rainwater system, to get the levels of nitrogen I saw in some of the emails you showed me, you'd have to have a flock of pelicans living on your roof. It's pretty unrealistic. Just ain't gonna happen. Sorry. However, the potential risks from birds are always associated with rainwater harvesting in the rhetoric. The reality is quite different, and even in our national rainwater guidelines in Australia by our National Health Council, there are like a secondary source of potential contamination. The nitrogen's not as high as, unless you've got a flock of pelicans on your roof, as what is perceived. There are Campylobacter is the key bacteria that can be in bird poo. Can give most of us a mild dose of the trots if we're drinking it, or we don't even know we've got it. If you're immunosuppressed, old or infirm, or have an illness, it can make you ill. But it's one of the most fragile secondary pathogens around. So it doesn't like UV, doesn't like changes in temperature. So if you've got the right treatment train in place, and if the birds are not directly accessing your stored water, so like getting into your tank, which is, it's probably not going to be an issue.
And one thing that I thought was really interesting, we talked about how if you didn't have good design and sensible maintenance practices, your end of line UV or sterilization is really unlikely to work anyways as well. Right?
It's a really good point, Michelle, because you're into this treatment train we're talking about, which is in your book, and you've done a great job describing that and making it simple. Mm-hmm. It is simple, really.
It's super simple. It's actually
you've got that in place and you're making it work. What's happening is, if you do have an end-of-line system, and when we finish, I'll talk about my house that totally runs off rainwater. It's going to work really well. But if you've got UV and you've got no other treatment train mechanism in there, your UV system's going to be coated with biofilms and all sorts of other stuff. And it's going to have to deal with a greater load of problems, and it's just not going to be effective. So this idea of we just treated end of line, throw a UV in there, is actually quite misleading, because UV light will just be coated by the materials that will shelter the bacteria. So it's not actually going to kill the bacteria as effective as you think. It's going to have a high maintenance burden without your treatment train you've talked about. But even more, bacteria likes to attach itself to particles. So if you've got lots of fine organic and sediment type particles in your rainwater system because you don't have a treatment train design, lots of organic materials and bacteria will attach themselves to these particles, and those particles shelter the UV light. So the UV isn't actually working because it's sheltering the bacteria. And we were resolving this very issue in a hospital in Australia recently on the work I was doing with our government. Mm-hmm. So they're going through all this end-of-line treatment they might have in a hospital. Sorry to be off track. And I said, just don't allow the particles into your warm water system, and then your UV systems will actually work properly. So I know that's quite different to rainwater harvesting, but it's the same concept. If you've got a treatment train system, that means all those particles are part of a biofilm or stripped out by your leaf diverter, which is very good for sediments as well. if you do have to have an end-of-line treatment system, it's probably going to work better.
Take us, be a little drop of water, Peter, and take us from your roof on your home in the rainwater harvesting system on your home right through tab. I think that would be a really interesting way to kind of help our listeners understand this treatment train idea that we've been talking about, from roof to tab.
I think that's a really nice way to think about it and a fun way to think about it. And that's the way we broke through in teaching this. Because when we first came up with these concepts, people went, no, it's not like that. So we took the little drop. And I also, very Canadian of me, I've got a golden retriever here in my office who's barking at me at the moment. So apologies,
Peter,
everyone.
he's just excited about treatment trains.
Yeah, she is. Hoping she'll get treats, yes. So, we have a very organic office. The golden retriever comes to my office, so keeps me company and out of trouble. So this little drop of water, I think that's really nice, Michelle. So it comes through the atmosphere, right? It collects stuff in your atmosphere depending on where you are. So if you're on the coast somewhere, it's going to pick up salts and manganese and things like that. If you're inland, it's going to pick up other stuff. It'll hit your roof, and it may or may not have bacteria in it. It's got from the environment and other things. If you're, say, just upstate New York, it'd probably have sulfur and some lead in there as well, because it depends on the density of the city and all sorts of things. Then it hits your roof, and it'll travel down your roof surface into your gutter. As it travels down your roof surface, there's a whole bunch of really interesting things going on. It can pick up whatever contamination that's sitting on your roof surface, but it can actually also lose contamination by traveling over the roof surface. It's a two-way process.
Interesting.
For instance, if your roof surface in the daytime and there's UV light, as it's traveling down, the UV light is actually changing what's in that drop of water, because there's a lot of bacteria that doesn't like that UV light and potential warmth for the roof surface. Then you'll hit your roof gutter. Do you guys call it gutter?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Or eaves trough. Only in Canada, I think.
So then that drop's traveling down your roof gutter. You understand from what I'm talking about that first flush is not a valid scientific concept here totally as well. And then it'll hit your downpipe and travel down your downpipe. So traveling along your roof gutter, I'm sorry, I got to tell some little stories along the way. We actually found that people who didn't clean out the roof gutters had better quality water.
Interesting.
In our surveys of rural Australia, because the water, this little drop of water, is traveling through all this debris in the roof. Think of your permaculture background, and it was doing the opposite to what we thought. It was actually cleaning the water as it's traveling through all that gunk in the roof. So I'm a rainwater harvesting practitioner. I've got the worst maintained gutters on earth, as my wife keeps telling me. So then it'll travel down the downpipe, and in my place, I've got a leaf diverter. So it hits the diagonal mesh, and the energy, the momentum is taken, if you're into physics, is taken out of that flow. And when the drop hits that diagonal mesh, if there's sediments in that and other materials, because of the change in momentum, so physics guys, it drops out materials in that interception. So with water, you change its flow, you intercept it, and you make it change its behavior in terms of how it flows and its energy.
If you don't know what a leaf feeder is, or what are they? Diverter, rainwater diverter. Just Google it. If somebody's watching right now, you can see images of them, but they basically just attach onto your downspout, and it's often a screen at a 45 degree that just captures all the larger debris particles and prevents them from going down into your tank.
Absolutely. And the research we found about these is those that have got two screens, a finer screen that's horizontal and the diagonal coarser screen, they were catching leaves and debris, and they're also catching sediments because of the change in energy. That's it, Michelle. That's it.
Yeah, I'm trying to do it.
Like that one.
I don't have the right angles.
So then that's running on, and you might have a first flush device. Please don't make them too big, because the bigger they are, the better the quality of water is not true. It's diminishing returns after about 20 litres of first flush storage for a typical house roof. So, well, depending on what your typical house roof is, you people over there have bigger houses than us. So the bigger they are, the better your water quality is not true. So you're passing over that first flush device. Some of the drops that are heavier because they've got, say, lead and that in them, or some other materials, will fall into that first flush device, because we actually found the first flush devices were brilliant for taking out sediments throughout a rain event, because first flush isn't always true, but not really good for taking out bacteria. But we found the leaf diverters were really good at taking out bacteria. So it's really interesting because the bacteria attaches to sediments. So then that drop falls into the tank. It passes through the water column. If you're throughout the day, your tank is changing. It's changing temperature around it. The ambient temperature around it is changing subtly. And this is quite important because it means the water is gently stirred, like James Bond, once his is gently stirred. This is such an important concept. And if you're using the water every now and again or fairly regularly, every time you take water out of the thing, you're creating a little movement in there. And what that's doing is those drops of water are constantly in contact with each other and the biofilms around the outside. And what Craig Evans discovered is there's what's known as competitive exclusion in the water column. So you need to be an ecologist. So the other bacteria in there doesn't have much nutrients. So whatever's in this drop of water will pass other drops of water, and they'll so there's bacteria in there. They'll eat each other because they're hungry, and then they'll pass by the biofilm because the tank is gently stirred, because you're taking water out of it. The temperature changes through the day, and so that contact point is actually aiding that biofilm and aiding the settlement process. And there's another natural thing going on up towards the top, because it's known as the water surface microlayer. So if your drop ends up there, bacteria like warmth and oxygen, and so they'll be up at that top layer. So if you stay away from there, you'll be fine. So if your drop's up there,
right, so don't draw from the top layer of the tank.
So in that top layer also, it's skin friction. So a bit of engineering physics. It's a skin friction layer. So if you get a glass of water and you fill it a bit, and the top of the water surface in your glass of water it's got a meniscus on it.
Right.
It's curved up or curved down, depending on how full your glass is. That's the skin friction. That happens in your water storage because it's gently stirred. And so it's holding stuff at that level. So anyway, then if your treatment train's set up properly, you're drawing your water from just above the sludge layer, because you don't want to muck around with that and upset its activity. Sludge layers, if your drop of water ends up passing through that sludge layer is not as fragile as made out in the literature. It's glued. There's cities of microorganisms. It's glued together using what's known as polysaccharides.
Right.
It's a very, very sticky chewing gum. So, and that's how they suck other things into it. And so they can be stirred up a bit depending on what sort of soil is around your location, which has kind of come from your drop of water. But if you're drawing your water from above that, so your drop of water gets drawn in above that, so you're not sucking in anything out of that sludge layer. And if you've got a pump, say, you're traveling through that pump, The pump operates at pressure. So it's applying pressure, a sudden change in pressure to the water drop. So the bacteria in that water drop will be compromised, if there's any bacteria there, by that sudden change in pressure. And then you're off to whatever tap you're going to use. So it's the journey of the drop. And I'll stop talking now because I could talk about that forever. But
yeah, no, it's great.
Well, you've missed because you've come out of the pump, and then do you have an outdoor tap and indoor taps? Your water.
So in my house, it supplies all the taps. So if it's going to the outdoor tap, one thing to watch out for: the quality of outdoor taps is nowhere near as good as indoor taps. So one of the things we found is they've got lead and nickel in them and other things and zinc. And their quality, because they're outdoor taps, is nowhere near as good as indoor taps. So sometimes when people are saying, "Oh, I've got these contaminants in my water supply, in rainwater supply, because I've sampled from my outdoor tap," it's actually coming out of your outdoor tap rather than from your rainwater supply. But say if you're going, say, to an indoor tap, say in my own house, I've got a little under sink filter from my drinking water tap. It's 0.2 micron, just near my pump on the way through, because I don't want any sediments to get through. I've got a 300 micron filter, so I'm intervening in the treatment train to get what I want out of it. But not try to do it all in the one place, which is what the philosophy of your book is about, the treatment train. So just before my pump, going back to the pump, I've actually got a 300 micron filter.
Right.
Sorry, 30 micron filter, and it's taking out all the sediments.
Yeah.
Which makes your pump work better and last longer, by the way, if you've got a pump. And then if it's to my drinking water tap in the kitchen, I've got a 0.2 micron filter, so it's just with activated carbon in that as well, and that's taking most things out. But through my hot water system, we discovered that hot water systems maintained at a normal heat, around the 55 to 60 degrees in a house, actually eliminate most of the harmful bacteria in that might be in rainwater. I'm not saying they are there, because they're not always there. So the little drop goes into the hot water system. I've got a storage hot water system. One day I'm going to get rid of that, and I want an instantaneous one because they're the best ones. And it enters that water. It's changing temperature from 15 degrees to, in my hot water system, just below 60 degrees. That sudden change in temperature just kills everything in it if there's any bacteria in it. So in the literature, everyone talks about pasteurization, but it's a process known as tyndallization that actually has the bacterial kill, because sudden change of temperature, sudden change of pressure actually eliminates bacteria. So there's my little drop. It's coming out of my hot water tap, my garden tap, or my kitchen tap for drinking.
So do you do any ongoing testing and water testing, water monitoring?
So my house is the most monitored house probably in the world, I think. It's got 20 years of comprehensive data, journal papers, everything be written about it. It's been used as when our government 20 years ago or 15 years ago started making policies to support rainwater harvesting. This house was used as the case study to say, well, look, it's got a lot of data, and in data we believe, and everything we're skeptical of. So when everyone was saying, oh, there's lots of problems, this house was saying, well, here's what happened over a long period of time. So I don't, in the early days, we did a lot of water quality testing, and we did water quality testing from 3,000 other houses too as part of our research. What we actually found, and everything that moves in this house is measured and tested. So happy to send the papers. It's quite interesting. But with the water quality, what we found is, well, if you're going to go testing and spending all that money, you need to know where to test. Because traditionally, people were testing rainwater from their outdoor garden tap, which was compromised anyway, or or they were dipping their sample jar into the top of their water storage in the tank, which is the worst quality water, if you've heard what I've said. So getting quite misleading results. So if you were testing your rainwater, you have to test it at the point of use, because you're testing the design of your system. So testing it, you know, somewhere in a storage or somewhere halfway through your treatment train is quite misleading, which is just the common occurrence.
Right. In fact, I think there's, I can't even remember where I read this, but I have seen recommendations to actually design in ports all over your system, even if you really had no intention of drawing water from that location, just for testing purposes.
Yeah. I wouldn't do that, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it makes no sense, really. And same idea is like, don't test the water you scoop out of the top of your tank. It's just going to give you an overly pessimistic view of water quality
result. So what we ended up with, which is we confirmed by a national survey of all these, you know, people around Australia with their rainwater harvesting systems, is, and what David Cunliffe says in our national health guideline is, it's quite counterproductive for people at home scale systems, as you call them, or household systems as we call them, to be actually running all these samples, because it's first you've got to know where to sample and how to sample, and then you've got to be able to get a laboratory that understands rainwater rather than mains water, which is quite different, and that's part of conversation for another day. As I explained before, E. coli is not E. coli in a rainwater harvesting system, potentially. So what we actually came up with is, and our national health guidelines say as well, it's down to these physical observation type processes. Is the water clear? Is your treatment train in place and operating the way it should be? And does the water smell? So you want water that doesn't smell and is clear. And you want to do your visual inspection to make sure that you know, things are operating the way it should be. What we actually found is people who were pretty slack about maintenance, like me, didn't have a big impact on the water quality of their tanks. But we actually found people who went and started desludging their tanks all the time and emptying them and throwing chlorine in, they did have water quality problems.
Right.
So you need a really sensible, common sense maintenance program.
Right.
Fantastic.
One more
I kind of want to ask about pH, monitoring pH, but only if you can answer it really quick.
You know, I think pH in rainwater is quite misleading, because the low pH is, unless you're in a polluted environment, it's just natural rainwater. Rainwater is a natural carbonate. Its pH should be 5.5 before it hits everything, and because its low pH isn't created by, you know, a pollution, unless you're in an acid rain environment, it buffers very quickly through your rainwater storage. So it can go in at 5.5 or 5, as we found in industrial cities, and even 4, and come out the other end at around 6-ish. pH is not a health concern.
That blew me away when we had that conversation. And that was actually something that came up when I was in Australia. And so I think there's even some misconceptions about that in Australia as well. So, but that's great that it pretty much solves itself. So I think what we'll do now is we're going to move on to the giveaway. And so we'll do that right now. And then from there, we will open it up for a couple of questions. Peter's already given us an hour and a half of his time this evening, and so I want to respect his time as well. And we will be having more conversations. I mean, literally, we can probably talk about this stuff forever. I find it completely fascinating, and obviously, you guys do too. We've had a really great uptake on the video this evening. We've had an amazing audience. So obviously you guys have found it very compelling as well, so that's great. And this video will be available on the Verge YouTube channel after the fact. And so you can watch it again. There's obviously a ton of data in here. Again, I highly recommend you check the show notes out. Peter's website is a wealth of knowledge, and you could literally spend a lifetime on there. I find myself on that website quite often, actually.
I'm going to jump in and say one thing. The book is Essential Rainwater Harvesting. So we actually don't get into the level of detail of conversations that we're having on this live stream video. We don't quite go into the conversation around the research other than referencing it. And that's why we wanted to have this conversation on YouTube. But on the other hand, if a lot of the stuff was way over your head and you just want okay, tell me what I need to know to design a system, that's really what we were trying to do in this book. So heads up, if that was a little bit over your head and you weren't so much interested in the exact science behind it, don't be too overwhelmed or worried about the book being that way. But we're going to continue to have these conversations because it's really important. And I think there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding around these systems, and some fear and some debate around the safety. So yeah, we need to continue.
And what a great opportunity to write the misinformation that's out there.
Mm-hmm.
So we're really excited to be able to contribute a little bit to that conversation, and with folks like Peter, it's great to be on that pathway. So
how are we gonna pick?
Let's just take a look here at some of the past comments. There's been a lot of comments tonight. And so by the way, if you are overseas, we probably won't be sending you a hard copy, but you can get an e-copy from us.
Yeah, if you're not in North America, we'll send you an ebook. That's what we'll do. Yeah.
So I think that we are going to give this book to Kathy McGowan tonight. So Kathy's been on a lot of our live streams. And so Kathy, if you want to send us an email at info@vergepermaculture.ca with all of your details on how we can get that book to you, then we will get that off into the mail right away.
Mm-hmm.
And let's take a couple more questions, and then I think we're going to call her a night.
Yeah, let's see how many we can squeeze in 15 minutes or less.
Yeah, and actually, do you want to make an announcement about the...
Yeah, we'll have more conversations like this, and we'll try and answer more questions. And I do actually have a Q&A section on our website, www.essentialrwh.com, or it's actually also vergepermaculture/rain, same website. The link is in the show notes. It's a really great idea if you're finding this this conversation interesting and you want to learn about the resources. We have tons of free resources, including I'll be posting that table 8.1 that summarizes the good design and sensible maintenance practices. That's where you'll get that. That's where you'll sign up to get that.
All right, so I'm going to actually take a question from Kathy. Advice on storing rainwater in our cold Canadian winter. So generally speaking, the way that we approach this, Kathy, is we've got to go below the frost line. And so when you do that, you've got to think about the loading on the tanks. And so there are specific tanks that are designed for that purpose, that are fit for that purpose. Another interesting thing that I just want to bring up, because so Michelle's grandmother lived in a northern town in Léoville, Saskatchewan, so north of Saskatoon. And I always loved going to this house. Unfortunately, it's not in the family anymore. But when this house was constructed, it actually had a cinder block water storage tank. So all the water got captured off of the roof, and it was an asphalt roof. And then it went into this cinder block storage tank in the basement, which had an open surface, and it was lined with tar. And I would have loved to have tested the water out of that tank. It didn't get used after Michelle's mother left the house. But Michelle's mom has fond memories of actually swimming in this rainwater tank. And so
it was like a bedroom in the corner of the basement that had been, blocked off with these cinder block walls. And that was the rainwater storage.
Totally. Sorry. And so as we've kind of adopted mains water, and I'm sure Peter has all sorts of stuff to say about that, but people kind of get lazy a little bit, and the tank stopped being used after there was a, pressurized water coming in from a centralized source. But I think it's interesting that in the early days, even places like northern Saskatchewan had similar constraints to places like Australia. I don't know if you want to speak in on any of that, Peter, but.
So Rob, I've had enough to say, but in my journeys through Canada, I saw lots of basements with rainwater storages in them, and in places like India and all around the world, and even in ancient Egypt, the basements of the dwellings were actually the original rainwater storage. I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
Interested to see what would have happened with the tar.
Yeah.
I know.
I think that's why their potatoes tasted so good.
I don't know. Yeah.
In fact, I don't know. Did you see Brad Lancaster's post on the cisterns built in Jordan
Yes.
and how they built them? Did you ever see that?
I didn't see his online thing. I was in the Middle East, and someone I was dealing with in a Middle Eastern water authority had some stuff from Brad Lancaster on his desk. So he was running a Middle Eastern irrigation scheme, and Brad was talking about these things that experienced in the Middle East. So he's a good source of information, guys.
He's great. He's fantastic. I love his website too. Absolutely. I don't know. You should check his blog out though, Peter. I think you'd get a kick out of this because two things. One, when they're building in Jordan and lots of those Middle Eastern countries, they'll often come across these old cisterns that were built in Roman times, and people will fall down these holes. And so they actually be really careful when they excavate that they don't uncover old cisterns. But when they build these things, they actually take jackhammers and they build holes, and they just continue to go down, and they lift all the rubble up by bucket. And so these guys are at the bottom of this, I don't know, 15, 20, 30 foot hole, 10 meter deep hole to store the 1 or 2 rains that you get in a desert environment like that. Super interesting. All right, let's see if we can find one more question here.
Asphalt roof, we talked about that.
So David Smith, and I know David's calling in from Australia. He's asking about asbestos, and we don't have any real asbestos roofs up here anymore, I don't think. But what's your take on that, Peter?
Well, you know what? This is where people would get quite surprised. When I worked for the water utility in the 70s, we laid a lot of asbestos water pipes that are still in action all over various cities, and I won't say where. So asbestos is a problem if it starts flaking off. I'm not sure that you should be drinking water harvested from asbestos roof, but we have water supplied by asbestos pipes in Australia, right? So from our water utilities, and I'm sorry to them for raising the issue. I think if the asbestos is in good condition, it's not going to give away particles, because it's the particles in asbestos that cause harm. Asbestos causes harm because you breathe it in, but my father-in-law passed away from mesothelioma from having asbestos in his stomach. So it's a rarer process. So I'd be cautious of asbestos roofs. They'd have to be in good condition. Maybe they need to be sealed. But I qualify that by, we get a lot of, in some areas of our country, and I won't say where, our mains water is delivered by asbestos pipes. So go figure.
Yeah, crazy. So I think we'll do this, the last question here, and then we'll close out for the evening. So Deidre says, I'm interested in learning how to remove aluminum, bromides, and chloramines. So we've talked a little bit about the metals with the biofilms, Deidre. And so I recommend checking out the Spinks report on Peter's website. It's really great for that. Chloramine, though, is something that is coming up more and more as a lot of smaller towns in Canada move to it, because chlorine will diminish as the further out in the network that it goes, is my understanding. And so chloramine doesn't have that same effect. And chloramine is a chlorine ammonia molecule, I believe. Is that correct, Peter? Am I right there?
Absolutely. And I've seen this question many times, Rob and Michelle. I think this person is actually asking about how to get rid of the treatment chemicals from the mains water system.
Yeah, like
Right.
putting your mains water into your rainwater system.
And what we found with all of our work, but in particular Anthony Spinks, who looked very closely at this, is if you've got a natural treatment train in your rainwater harvesting system, it's actually taking those, and Abigail Morrow worked a bit on this too, it's actually taking a lot of those materials from your water. So, and we also found that in our country there were, before we won the argument with the water companies, there was lots of people topping up their rainwater harvesting systems with mains water. And the argument was, oh, well, you know, those chemicals from the mains water will interact differently with the rainwater harvesting. So what we actually found is the biofilms and sludge and so on was diminishing the those residual chemicals in the mains water.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Super interesting. Well, Peter, we've used a ton of your time, and we're super appreciative, and we'll definitely host another one of these conversations. Did you have any?
Well, we didn't get through all of our questions.
No, but we knew we wouldn't.
You'll have to have another one to get through the rest.
Absolutely.
I want to let listeners know that there's also a coupon code to get 25% off of our book and the spreadsheet tool we built as well. Both there's option for ebook or for a soft cover version. Head to the same link, essentialrwh.com, in the show notes, and the coupon code is also in the show notes. It's good for 2.5 days till Friday at midnight.
Yep,
yeah,
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So Peter, any closing thoughts from you? What's at stake here? Why is it important that we get this right? How do we plot the right course here in North America and even other parts of the world that are looking at these systems as well?
That's the topic of a whole new webinar, Rob, but extremely briefly is, we talked about this award that myself and my colleague won at the start of this. We won it for showing that small systems are really the way to go to change the consequences of the big systems and the big challenges like climate change, population growth, degradation of the environment. We have to start from the bottom up. So that's the way forward for you guys. It's not just rainwater harvesting, it's part of the culture, isn't it?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. You know, I watched a webinar not that long ago, or a YouTube video not that long ago, from a physicist, and his name is eluding me right now. But he said that collapse is not possible. We don't, it's not a choice. And I know a lot of people that watch this channel think about that because of the state of our ecologies and the state of everything. Again, it's a topic for another evening. And as Peter said, if you look at the smart money in cities, the smart money in individuals, we're moving towards decentralized solutions: energy, water, waste, food. It is the remedy to the problem. Anything else is just dealing with the symptoms and not the root cause. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of things that Peter has spent his life collecting, which we've done some summarization in this book, but really there's so much there that I've been trying to convince Michelle to write a book with Peter called the Complete Rainwater Harvesting, but it would probably end up being the size of the Bible. But the message here is that the research actually provides the information that will empower individuals to take these moves, because it's not as complex as people. The mechanisms are complex that are going on inside of these systems, but the elements that you need to put a good system together are not as complex as you might think. And so it is a very empowering option for rain. And you know, it's interesting how the world has seemed to adopt these Tesla power walls by storm. All we're doing, and all Peter is advocating for, and all we're advocating for, are water walls. They don't necessarily have to sit on your wall, but in the same way that the battery storage, which Peter also has in his house, solves a lot of the centralized grid issues that we see in electricity, these water systems have a very similar, analogous effect when we start looking at them in aggregate. And we didn't even touch on effects of stormwater and and other
Energy, Water G, Energy Nexus. Yeah.
There's so many more things that we can cover. And so it's a really empowering story. Decentralization is going to be the way of the future. And we're going to need an army of people to put these systems together. And so hopefully you found some great nuggets of information on there in here tonight. Stay tuned to the channel for more conversations with Peter and other rainwater harvesting folks. And as Michelle said, head over to our website, essentialrainwaterharvesting.com, for any information for our free toolbox, for access to our book and access to our spreadsheet. And then check out Peter's website in the show notes below. If you found that useful, give us a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and we'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Peter.